so beautiful to look out and see all your faces on this rainy, cozy day to have a day to experience wonderful books and authors. And we are grateful to all of you. We care about every donation. We all work really hard to keep our festival free for all. We do want to thank our top donors: Richie Battle, Randy and Lisa Cohn, Ellen and Linwood Dame, Elizabeth Galvin, Adam and Ramona Nee, Nancy Seaman and Alan Schwartz, Beth Wilkinson and David Gregory, and our top sponsors, the White Elephant and the Boston Globe. So we are very appreciative of everyone who helps us keep this festival going. And it's really joy for me to introduce this segment because both Lois Romano and Kathleen Matthews are really old friends of mine, and I have followed both of their careers. So history has a way of remembering the powerful and erasing the reality of those who stood beside them. Lois Romano was determined to change that narrative and rewrite the history of America's First Lady. Lois is one of Washington's most distinguished journalists, a writer, editor, and columnist whose decades at the Washington Post and Politico gave her an unmatched eye for the human story behind the political headlines. Now she turns that formidable lens on one of history's most misunderstood and overlooked figures in the New York Times best-selling The Inconvenient Widow, The Torment, Trial, and Triumph of Mary Todd Lincoln. In this story about power and loss and resilience is a portrait of a woman of fierce intelligence with keen political instincts and profound courage. A woman who helped shape one of America's most consequential presidents. Joining Lois in what promises to be an illuminating conversation is Kathleen Matthews, a veteran television journalist and communications strategist who understands the Washington workings of the navigation of public life and personal story. Please welcome Lois Romano and Kathleen Matthews.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. I am usually in the audience at the book festival and love being a member of the audience, but I am so honored to be here on the stage this year with my good friend Lois Romano and Mary Haft. And congratulations on 15 years of the Nantucket Book Festival. I know it's been a labor of love, and look at this success. It's just amazing. So Lois Romano is just coming off a amazing national book tour for her book, An Inconvenient Widow. And she has been interviewed by David Rubenstein at the Library of Congress and also at Ford's Theater. She's been interviewed by Dave Barry at the Miami Book Festival and other luminaries. I have the advantage of really knowing Lois. We've been really, really good friends for like 30, 40 years. And I also had the advantage of kind of seeing this book come to life. Lois and I are walking partners here in Nantucket and also in Washington, D.C. So I got to hear the real-time play-by-play of how she discovered things, the revelations, the insights, and the process. So I want to start there, Lois. And by the way, as a journalist, I never tell the people I'm interviewing their questions. And last night, Lois and I had dinner, and at the end, she said, "You didn't even tell me what you're going to ask." And I've said, "Of course not. I'm a journalist. I never tell people what I'm going to ask as questions." So this is all a surprise. But let's start, Lois, with the process, because you have interviewed many First Ladies in real time in your journalistic career at the Washington Post and also at Politico. But here you have a First Lady who died many, many years ago. Everybody who knew her or anybody who knew somebody who knew her is already dead. So tell us the process that you had to go about that it was different from the normal process of a journalist that is reporting and interviewing and profiling somebody in real time.
Thank you. Oh, hello. Okay, that's a great question. First, I want to just thank everybody for being here and for coming out in the rain. I want to thank the Book Festival. And in particular, I want to thank my friend Mary Haft, who we also go back 30 or 40 years. I don't want to document it too much, but Mary and others had the vision for the Book Festival, and this is like a phenomenal year, and I'm really honored to be here. And also my husband is here, who has really given up a lot of his time for this process. Okay, so how did this work? The last decent book on Mary was probably done about 40 years ago. And it was, when I say decent, I mean that the writer tried to give her some agency, which she had never had. But from that time until now, a lot more scholarship had opened up. And the most important thing that happened was the digitization of a lot of the scholarship. So that really opened a lot of doors for me. I did approach it as a journalist. I did write these profiles of first ladies and of presidents when I was at the Washington Post. And the goal was always to try to peel back the layers. So you're not just reporting facts, but you're using those facts to try to interpret them, to try to paint a portrait of your subject. And that's what I did with Mary. I was very lucky that Mary was a prolific letter writer. She was well educated. And her letters are fascinating because they show the whole trajectory of her life, but they also show her anxiety. They show her highs, their lows. So that was very helpful. And for me, the most exciting thing was that the newspapers from this time period are now digitized. And it was so exciting for me that I had so many citations in there that Simon & Schuster said, okay, enough with the newspapers. But to me, it was telling the story. It wasn't only telling the story, and then they weren't all factual. So you could see the criticism that Mary was enduring. And you could get a perspective of how the nation had turned on her and why, and that was really fascinating to me.
In real time, she did not get a lot of affection from the media, from Lincoln's former law partner, many of whom actually wrote the narrative while Mary was alive. A lot of first ladies get a lot of criticism.
They do.
In reading this and writing this book, how did your perception of the actual role of First Lady and what First Ladies are up against evolve based on sort of the First Ladies you interviewed in real time that you have lived with and Mary Todd Lincoln, and watching in retrospect what she endured?
It's a very tricky job being First Lady because you, unless it's very unusual, you actually do have a lot of influence, but you're not allowed to show that influence. Even today, it's very difficult to show any sort of influence in the White House. I like to say that I see Mary as one of the first modern First Ladies because she just was out there. She got out there to be the face of the war, and she also, early on, she would, when Lincoln was elected during the transition, she would sit in on meetings about who he was going to appoint. And he didn't always listen to her, but he invited her into the meetings. And later, in real time, she did not get criticized for that. But as time wore on and people look back on it, some newspaper people said, well, she sat in the room and she wouldn't leave the room. But look, Lincoln wanted her there. But if you look back on all the First Ladies, Eleanor Roosevelt, that had criticism, you have Eleanor Roosevelt, you have Hillary Clinton, you're looking at people who actually wanted to be activists. They wanted to be seen, and they wanted to take a stand. And I think that's what Mary did. Mary was also one of the first modern First Ladies because of her media coverage was extraordinary. It was unprecedented for 1860. She had so many news stories on her. No other First Lady had ever had that. When she went on vacation that first year, the New York Tribune took the incredible step of assigning a reporter to stalk her. And he went to this little town by the beach in New Jersey, and every day the newspaper would say, the movements of Mary Lincoln. And some of that would happen today, but that was extraordinary for the day.
And a lot of presidents actually say in conversation, without my First Lady, I would never be here. You argue that that is truly the case with Abraham and Mary Lincoln, that there's a good likelihood he would never have run for president if he hadn't married Mary Todd Lincoln.
I believe that. It's a controversial point of view because some scholars just, well, a lot of scholars have come around to that, I will say that. But here's what happened with Mary's story. Her story was told by men who didn't like her, and because First Ladies were not written a lot about in the 1800s, other scholars moved that story forward. So she never got a really fresh look. On Lincoln's rise, she played a pivotal role. He was ambitious, he was brilliant, he was a tactician, he was an incredible politician, but he was an awkward man. He came from poverty, he was not educated, he was self-educated. Mary was very finely educated. She was the first lady to show up in the White House more educated than her husband. And she decided that she was going to help make him president. And he had a lot of self-doubts about whether he could get there. And he also was a depressive, which doesn't often get reported in current scholarship. It's mentioned, but it's mentioned in a way that gives, and this is not wrong, but it gives him agency. It says he was empathetic. It made him give him moral authority, his depression. It also put him in a funk, and he would become paralyzed. And Mary had some mental illness herself, but she was manic. And so it was an interesting combination. So he would go into these funks and trances, like some people that knew him would say he would go into a trance. And she would be like, "You will be president, I know." And he would quote her, he'd say, "Well, Mary thinks I'm going to be a senator and a president, but I don't know, you know." So I believe, and also in real time, even a couple of men that hated her, there's documentation that says that without her, he probably wouldn't have gotten to the White House. That she, her cousin, who was also his law partner, and who also knew Mary's liability, said that he always thought it was Lincoln's political brilliance, and Mary was political, and Mary's energy that did the deed was the word that he said. And it changed a little bit when they got to the White House. She was still advising him, but as we know from Doris Kearns Goodwin's fabulous book, Team of Rivals, Lincoln surrounded himself with very smart men. So she wasn't quite in the room all the time, although she had his ear first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. And we can see traces of that, and I document that in the book.
So kind of a yin and a yang in terms of their dynamic. Where did Mary really start to get into trouble? And you know, because there, as you argue in the book, there is certainly validation for some of the negative narrative that came out about her.
Right, and I was very careful in the book, and if those of you who read it will see this, that I was anticipating a lot of pushback from scholars, particularly male scholars. And so I document every bad thing she did. And I explain some of them I can't explain, that was just bad judgment. She was an anxious woman growing up. There's letters from her friends that say she was like an April day. She would be up and sunny and great, and then she would be drowning in the tears. So she had issues, they were inherited. Her family had some issues like this. It was high anxiety, which could have been treated today. But when she was in the small town of Springfield, she was such a nice woman and kind and generous to her neighbors that people would just say, you know, it's fine, she'll be fine tomorrow. Or when they knew Lincoln was traveling and she would get so anxious if there was a thunderstorm, they would send their kids over to spend the night with her. So she was in a cocoon that helped her through this, and people were naming their children after her. Where she ran aground was in the White House. I don't think she was prepared to go into the White House by her upbringing, but I don't think she anticipated what would happen when Lincoln got elected in this really highly divided country. The war started a month later, and the entire half the country, full half the country, hated Lincoln, and by extension, they hated her. They hated her for a couple of reasons. One is that she was married to Lincoln, but also she was a Southerner. So the South, who wanted to preserve slavery, thought that she was a traitor. And the North thought she was a spy, so she just couldn't win. On either side, she was being attacked, and she became a scapegoat because, at least in the North, and they didn't want to criticize the president. They were supporting the president, the Republicans. But a lot of Republicans were abolitionists, and they believed that maybe she was holding Lincoln back on abolition, and she was not. Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he was not an abolitionist early on, and he was just being extremely cautious.
It was also really tough times to live in. I mean, just imagine the country fully divided. Medical care. Right?
Just imagine.
This is why you're going to like the book. That was a little.
There are
test,
echoes in
a
the
little
book.
test thing I was throwing out there.
There were echoes.
So the country is totally divided, and I think we do feel, as you read the book, some of the same feelings that we have today. But you know, it was also a time in which sanitation wasn't nearly as good. Transportation was so difficult to get around, even within your state. Childbirth was a precarious experience. And so you really create this sense of the times. And here is Mary Todd Lincoln, who loses 3 children, ultimately, out of 4 sons.
Before adulthood.
1 before she goes to the White House, 1 at the White House, and then she loses her husband. Talk about what it would be like for any woman to endure all those things, you know, that Mary had to go through.
I couldn't do it. When I'm reading these stories about her, my heart ached. The first child was born just shy of his 4th birthday, and any of you who have children and grandchildren know that a 4-year-old is a little person. And he died from, they believe, tuberculosis. But she was a young woman, and although it was incredibly painful for the Lincolns, she pushed forward because she could have more children. And she became pregnant very quickly and then had 2 more sons. So they never got over that loss, but they could move forward. He got elected. In the White House, her favorite son died. He was 11 years old, and his name was Willie. And that was an incredible tragedy. And that's when it became more challenging for her to control her emotions. I mean, she went into a very deep funk. And one of the things that Mary was criticized for, which is extraordinary to me, is that she mourned too long. And I don't even know what that means. I mean, how can you mourn too long? She put on black and wouldn't take it off for a couple of years. She stopped. There were performances by the Marine Corps Band on the White House grounds and also in Lafayette Park. She stopped the ones on the White House lawn, and then she asked them not to play at Lafayette Park. And this is where she was starting to get criticized. Like, okay, you know, we need a cabinet member had to go to Lincoln and said, it's been a year, can we start the ones at least at Lafayette Park? So she was being heavily criticized and for mourning too long, and also there were some really nasty unsigned newspaper articles almost suggesting that, you know, it was karma, that this should happen to her because her husband had sent so many people to war and so many kids were dying. And it was just a very sad time for her. And on the 3rd child, she was just, you know, Lincoln dies, and she was just coming out of her mourning, which it took forever. And it's like in 71, maybe 1871, we're 6 years from the assassination. And she's in Europe, and you can see through her letters that she's experiencing some joy. She has the 3rd son with her. The 4th son is in Chicago, and you can see her coming out of it and talking about how Tad takes care of her, and she's taking care of Tad. And then she comes back to Chicago, and Tad dies from consumption. I think it was pleurisy, like he had a frail constitution. I think it was pneumonia, really. And then she's shot. I don't mean shot, but she's just gone. I mean, now she's just traveling the country, trying to make some sense of her life, and she's seeing spiritualists. And she's shopping a lot. She was a compulsive shopper, but she also wasn't spending the principal of her money. She was just spending the interest. But her son didn't know that. Her last remaining son, I sometimes say that Mary lost 4 sons because the oldest son turns on her. And it's driving him crazy that she's shopping so much. Not his money, her money. And she's seeing spiritualists to try to reach her 3 dead children and her husband. And for me, my heart is aching. I'm thinking she's just trying to find some peace somewhere in her life.
So you clearly empathize with her. and that is, throughout the book. Tell us why you think that empathy that you have clearly as a mother, as a wife of a prominent political lawyer in Washington, why, as someone who has friends who've maybe worked through mental illness and anxiety and different things, why that makes you write this book so differently than many of the other people who tried to write Mary's story?
I think, and I wrote this in an op-ed in the New York Times, I think more women need to be writing these stories of these women. And that's not to say thank you. That's not to say that there are some fabulous male scholars out there, but I do think that women can walk in the shoes more skillfully of women that have been maligned and sort of feel their pain. And Mary's story was written by men. And that story took hold and it just could not be dislodged. Two of the better books that were done on her, one in 1950 and the one in 1985, were written by women, and they are definitely more empathetic. But Mary's not alone in this. I mean, if you look at the stories of Joan of Arc, I mean, her story initially, why she was burned at the stake, her story is written by men, and it's not till later when it's propagandists. Propagandists are writing the story, and they're telling a story, and all they're seeing is somebody they don't like, that maybe is too outspoken. They're not taking into account at all what she went through, her loss. She was holding hands with her husband when he was shot next to her. And so I believe as a woman, I was able to get into her head a little bit more, although I will tell you that my husband said to me not long ago that he reread the epilogue of the story and it brought tears to his eyes, because just recapping everything that she had gone through and how somebody couldn't see that is just beyond me.
Let's go to the night of the assassination.
Okay.
And it certainly was chilling to watch you on the stage at Ford's Theater with the box where all this happened just a couple weeks ago. If Mary hadn't had sort of these eruptions of anxiety, if she hadn't been so stressed in the White House at the point at which the war was resolving itself, do you think that that night might have changed? Might there have been a different narrative based on who might have been in the box with them, or
You mean had he not been assassinated?
Yes. Do you think there was anything in Mary's behavior that actually might have made the narrative go the way it did?
I think that had he not been assassinated, they...
No, I'm going back to...
I'm sorry.
I'm going back to sort of what Mary did that maybe put him at more peril that night. I'm talking about Grant.
I see where you're going. Okay, so she was mentally deteriorating towards the end of the war, and she had high anxiety. And right before the war ended, General Grant invites them to City Point, Virginia, to review the troops and do, kind of check out everything. And Lee we're very close to Lee surrendering. And she has a total meltdown, and there's no other way. It's a psychotic break. So she's riding in a carriage. They're all going to review the troops, and she's riding in a carriage with Grant's wife, Julia, and the wife of the prevailing general is an accomplished rider, and she's riding next to Lincoln and the general. And Mary just loses it. She doesn't know why this woman is riding with Lincoln on a horse. And what's really bothering her, and she wasn't, I'm one of the people who don't believe that she was jealous of Lincoln. I believe she was jealous of her prerogatives, and she wanted to be the queen. And what she said during this whole meltdown is that she was worried that people thought that the woman that was riding with Lincoln was her. And she was so frustrated, and she was saying, why is that woman next to him? Who gave her permission to be there? And the guy driving it was an ambulance, but it was a carriage, said, well, it was run by the president. She goes, are you saying that the president invited her to ride? It was just an awful, horrible experience. So fast forward, and it was hard on Julia Grant because she's trying to calm her down, and then Mary's like demanding to get out of the carriage and said she'll walk the rest of the way, and it was really awful. And Lee resigned. Lee surrenders, and the war's over a few weeks later. And the theater comes up, and Lincoln invites Grant to go to the theater. And Julie won't go. She just says, I'm not going to go sit in the box with that woman. She says, that was really not a good experience for me. When she wrote her own book, though, interestingly, Julia cleaned it up, and she just said it wasn't that bad. I understand that Mary was anxious, but, it wasn't as bad as this other guy, Badeau, wrote it. And so she won't go. And she says, we're going to go visit our kids. Our kids are in New Jersey. And what people suspect is that Grant never went anywhere without a few guards. And he would have had guards outside that box if he had gone. And probably John Wilkes Booth would not have got into the box. What I learned just the other day is that Wilkes Booth's gun, the Derringer, only had one bullet in it. So it's not like he could have shot his way in. He had one bullet to kill Lincoln. So if there had been guards at that box, he probably could not have entered it, and Lincoln might have survived.
And so here is Mary, at what you would think would be, and Lincoln at the apex of their lives and their careers, because the war is over. He has been vindicated. He loves the theater. She loves going out. They even do a carriage ride before going to the theater.
Romantic carriage ride.
But they can't get anybody to go to the theater with them. And they get the wrong security guard, don't they?
Yeah, so part of the reason some people didn't go, that was the reason for the grants, but also people were worried about security. Lincoln still had a target on his back, even though the war was ended. And Stanton, the Secretary of War, was supposed to go, and he didn't want to go for security reasons. So Lincoln invited his teletyper, who Lincoln was close to, because he would walk across the street to the War Department and read all the things coming in on the war. And Stanton wouldn't let the teletyper go. And said, and he was so concerned. He didn't want Lincoln to go to the theater that night. So they finally invite a guy named Rathbone. He's a military official, and his fiance, who was Clara Harris, who was the daughter of a U.S. senator, young couple, and then a guard gets assigned. There was no Secret Service at that point. A guard, and not a good guard, a mediocre guard, gets assigned to Lincoln because his regular guy is off for the night. And the guy, that when you go back and read the stories, the guy, his name was Crook or something, he did not have a good record. He had been cited for a lot of misbehavior, and he decides that he doesn't need to guard the door. And he steps away, and his story later was that he wanted to see the play better, but people said they spotted him in a saloon. And the thing about John Wilkes Booth is, I'm sure most of you know, he was an actor, so he was well known to Ford's Theater, so he had the run of the place. Nobody stopped him when he walked up to the box.
And so they carry Lincoln across the street, and it's the worst night imaginable for any wife, isn't it?
Well, it's terrible, and she, they carry him across the street to this townhouse. It's a very small, narrow townhouse. They put him in a small room, and it's extraordinary, the story, because she's not really welcome in the room, and they're not really consulting with her on his care, which I don't know if they did back then, but, at one point, they're trying to get him ready to, to try to take care of him, and they ask her to leave, and every male senior politician in Washington was still hanging on to Lincoln's pant leg as he died. So through that tiny room, maybe 55 men went through that night. It was extraordinary. And you could look up some portraits. You should look at the portraits. The portraits are not accurate because they put everybody in the room at the same time, which wasn't true. But still, Supreme Court justices, senators, undersecretaries of Treasury were getting in the room. And Mary was sort of allowed in once an hour. And then at the end, at 7 o'clock in the morning, this went on from 10 at night till 7 in the morning, she goes in for the last time, and Lincoln looks awful. And his face is by now, he's about to die. His face is bloated, he's discolored, his eye is swollen, and she faints. And the Secretary of War comes out and says, take that woman out of here and don't let her back in. So Lincoln dies 20 minutes later. And they don't go out and tell Mary immediately. Instead, they all have a prayer over his body without inviting her in for the prayer. And then the minister comes out and says, your husband has died. And she said, why didn't you tell me? And he said, because we all thought it was better not to. So they don't give her that moment of the last moment to say goodbye to him or to be there for the prayer over his body, which is just astonishing to me.
And it's not only official Washington, all the power players of Washington in that room, it's her oldest son, too.
Yeah, her oldest son was in the room, too.
And didn't bring his mother in.
And he didn't bring his mother in, right.
And that's the slippery slope that kind of unfolds in the latter part.
Some of it was misogyny. I mean, you know, she was also it was hard to console her. She was crying a lot, and they just didn't know what to do with her. You know, so they brought her in the room, and she'd be crying, and it was distraction. But it was also, you know, a woman shouldn't be in the room. The guy's dying, and she shouldn't be in the room. And it's just tragic. And she writes about it later, about how there was things she wished she could have said to him, even though he was unconscious. I mean, it's so painful to read some of her letters about those last moments.
So Andrew Johnson, who succeeds Lincoln, gives her some grace, lets her stay in the White House for a pretty extended period of time.
5.5 weeks.
And then she has to figure out where to go. And there's really no support system for first ladies at that point in our history, is there?
Nothing. She has absolutely nothing. And a good friend of Lincoln's took over the estate. Lincoln had some money, but he died intestate, so it had to go to probate. And a guy named David Davis, who was sitting on the Supreme Court, takes over it, and he wants her immediately to move back. They own the house in Springfield, and she didn't want to go back there, which is her prerogative. She does not want to. I mean, the Obamas didn't go back to Illinois. You can go wherever you want. So
if you have the money to do it.
If you have the money, right? She did not want to go back because of the memories. When Mary was mourning, she just needed to not be around the mourning situation. She refused to go back there, and he would not budge on the money. He gave her an allowance of the equivalent of about $50,000 a year, and she's a former first lady. And she would write letters that were criticized in real time, where she would say, I just want to buy a house. I want to, you know, I should be able to live according to my station in life. And she was criticized for those kinds of words, but I totally get it. She's coming out of the White House, and why shouldn't she be able to buy a house? This man sat on that estate money for 2.5 years, and she was unable to buy a house. She finally scraped some money together to buy a house because she was so desperate to have a home, but then she couldn't afford to maintain it. And she's writing him these poignant letters saying, I can't afford the fuel bill. Can you please give me some extra money? And he wouldn't. And when the estate was settled, you could see on the ledger that he did give her son a lot of extra money to set up a bachelor pad in Chicago. So it's just an extraordinary story. It was like he was punishing her for some unknown reason. And finally, when the estate is settled, she takes the money and goes to Europe, and she does fine in Europe. I mean, you know, she can make decisions for herself. She just wanted independence.
And that's the phenomenal thing also to think about those times. And once she kind of pulls herself out of this mourning, gets some of the money, she is so courageous to take a son over to Europe, live in Europe for a while. She speaks fluent French from her education as a young woman. So that is pretty phenomenal, don't you think, for the times?
What I found phenomenal is that everybody mistook strength for weakness. This woman was pretty resilient. I mean, she lasted 17 years, another children dying, you know, trying to navigate, trying to, you know, scrape some money together, fighting for a pension, which, by the way, was precedent-setting. The Congress made her fight for 5 years for a modest pension, and because of her efforts, every First Lady now gets a pension. And she rarely gets any credit for that. But I look at this woman and I see an incredibly resilient human being. And men over the course of her lifetime and later, and for decades and 100 years later, just saw her as a weak, hysterical woman.
So I think that's a good moment to invite our audience to come in and ask questions for the final 15 minutes. We have a microphone here in the room that will move around, and I think we have a question right here in the front row. Just wait a second. We'll get the microphone over to you. There we go.
Just for fun, have you seen Oh, Mary?
Oh, absolutely. It's hilarious, and I would recommend it if it comes your way, or if you're near New York to go. It's going to be. I think it's starting to travel next month. It's very funny. It has no reality, but and I say this in the book that. Because her story was so distorted, it made it easy for Cola Scola to write this story, in which she is an alcoholic cabaret singer. She neither sang nor drank. And the only thing that concerns me, and I love the producers, I've spoken to the producers, and they're very supportive of this book. The only thing that concerns me about the play is that I worry that a whole generation of people are now going to think that really is Mary. You know, that's the narrative they've inherited, and now it's even worse than they thought, you know.
That's why it's so important to buy this book and get your friends to buy this book.
Thank you.
We have another question over there.
I did just that. I'm about 25 pages in. So what I was curious about is, how should we think about the word triumph in the subtitle, and just reacting to the New York Times review that mentioned that might be misplaced? Like, as I read it, I'd love to have your voice in my ear and think about that theme of triumph.
That's a very good question. Somebody else asked me that. And I think the answer to it is that, and I say I think because I probably didn't think it through, I'm being honest here, as much. I do think she finds peace at the end of her life. And so in that sense, I think she's triumphant. The last phase of her life, after, we didn't even get into this, but her son, the oldest son, ends up committing her to a sanitarium, and and then he goes on vacation, and then she gets herself out, which is like an extraordinary story, while he's on vacation. And then she immediately goes to Europe, and she builds a life for herself. She makes friends, she travels, and I think she finds true peace as much as one can. And while she's away, she starts to miss her family, and she sees that her son, and she's not speaking to her son. I mean, she was so angry. And she sees that he's been named the Secretary of War, and she's in communication with her sister, and she wants to come home, and she wants assurances that he won't commit her again. And of course, he was never going to do that again. He knew that was a bad deal. And so she comes home, and they do reconcile. So I think that's a little bit also part of the triumph, that somewhere at the end of her life, she finally finds some peace.
Yeah,
But that's
it's
a
more
great
than
question.
survival or even prevailing.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
I love that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's a very good question.
Oh, thanks.
And triumphing over incredible odds. I mean, getting
That's right.
yourself out of a sanitarium.
I'll add that to my answer. Yes.
Yes.
Wondering, you mentioned the relationship with her family, her sister in particular, moving to Springfield, right?
In Springfield, yeah.
What with the relationship with the entire Todd family, so to speak, after she married a Lincoln?
It was bad. Well, so her father, just for some of you who don't know, her mother dies when she's 6 years old, and her father immediately, and there's 5 children. The husband runs out and finds another wife because he needs a mother for the children. Then they proceed to have 9 more children. So the household, and this is why Mary had to get out of that household. She leaves when she's 19. But so the household has, I think, 14 or 15 kids in it, and the second family largely becomes, maybe all of them, become Confederate supporters. And so they were all kind of keeping it together. The families were divided, but they all kept it civil for a while. When the war starts, there's the civility ends. And 3 of her half-brothers fight for the Confederacy. A brother-in-law fights for the Confederacy, and her half-sisters are married to Confederate supporters. So the family's totally divided. They are a family divided. And Mary, you know, a couple of her sisters would later write that it was painful for Mary, and I'm not sure it was, because those sisters were not talking to Mary. And Mary, if you crossed Abraham Lincoln, Mary crossed you off her list. She held the grudges in the family, and when her seamstress comes in and says to her, I didn't want to raise this with you, but I'm so sorry, I heard Alec died. He died in battle. And she said, oh, you shouldn't be sorry. I don't mourn for Alec because he turned on my husband. He's fighting against my husband. So he made his choices, and that's the way it is. And the seamstress was kind of startled. I mean, Mary was all Abraham Lincoln all the time, and incredibly loyal. But she died, and the family was divided. She was mostly close to the first family.
And that fierce loyalty is what a lot of first ladies get criticized for, don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah. Right there with the microphone.
So thank you for writing this book and for putting your...
Oh, there you are. I'm like, okay, all right, I see you now.
For
Okay.
helping Mary out. So have you talked to Dr. Sotos about his vitamin B12 deficiency.
I didn't talk to him, but I read it. I think that, and I think I might have included it in the book. I think Mary had so many complicated issues. I don't believe that that was her primary issue. That might have been something that came in later. But I think she had diabetes, which I think was a huge issue.
Highs and lows.
Yes, the highs and lows, but also it deteriorated her eyesight, and it caused a lot of her issues. She had so many complex, especially when she got older, mental and physical ailments. And I think probably vitamin B deficiency could be one, but add it to the mix is basically what I would say. There's so many things that she died from. She died of a stroke.
I think we can take one or two more questions right here in the center. Thank you.
How easy was it for her son, given the laws at that time, to have her institutionalized?
It would have been easier if he had done it about 5 years earlier, because any man could commit any woman for any reason. A child could commit a mother. And then there was an incident that happened with a particular woman named Elizabeth Packard, where she got a law passed in Illinois where you had to bring it to trial. That being said, her son created a sham trial. So it wasn't as hard as it looked. He basically got his father's friends together who were trying to help him. He was 32 years old. And I think they were trying to help him because they thought maybe he had a political future, which he never wanted to run for office. And so they basically got 7 doctors to testify, all based on Robert's position. I think one of the doctors had treated her, none of the others did, testify that she was insane. They got the shopkeepers who were selling her merchandise and taking her money to say, one guy said, well, she came in and bought all this stuff and she looked crazy. And I'm like, well, why did you take her money? Why didn't you just call her son then? And then they had people in the hotel who were snooping through her things saying she was buying things she wasn't opening. So they stacked the whole thing. She walks into a courtroom with 300 people. I can't even imagine this poor woman walking into this courtroom. She was totally sandbagged. The jury is already seated. The judge is sitting there. She doesn't even have a lawyer except somebody that her son got for her, who doesn't cross-examine anybody. I think maybe he asked one question. So it wasn't as hard as it seemed, and he orchestrated the whole thing. I mean, it was such a rigged trial. It was pathetic. 3 hours of testimony, and she's, quote, convicted of insanity in 10 minutes.
And why do you think Robert did that? What is the primary reason a son would do that, and why did he do it, Lois?
I think he was just embarrassed by her, and he might have been embarrassed for his father's legacy. And at that point in her life, she was a little wacky, and you've known people like this, but she wasn't bothering anyone. She was just living in her own little world, and she was going to the stores a lot. Somebody told him people were coming in and out of her hotel room, and it was spiritualists, and he was embarrassed. And I think his friends were saying to him, why can't you just take over? You're the man of the house now. Can't you take over her finances? And I want to tell you one funny thing so I don't seem like I'm covering for Mary. When the Chicago fire happened in 1871, Mary took all of her money out of the safety deposit box, and they were bearer bonds, and they were worth over $1 million. And she sewed them into her dress. And her son, during this period, her son learned about this, and he was just horrified. And he was worried, and he didn't really have to worry about this. He was worried that the spiritualists were going to fleece her. But Mary would have never given the money. I don't think she was going to be robbed, but she would have never turned the money over. And just to get back to the question, he just wanted her off the street. He couldn't stand dealing with it anymore. People calling him saying she's shopping here and there. Harmless activity.
So there's so many more insightful and juicy stories like that in this book. I hope we've whet your appetite, and that Lois will be joining afterwards to sign books. Thank you very much, and thank you for writing such a great book.